Yes, thank you so much for speaking with me. I truly enjoy what's going on in the second season. My question is, as a showrunner and kind of the creator of this, how do you unattach yourself from what we know is going to be the end of what we know these characters will end up as, and create them kind of from fresh and new so that they can go any way? We know that Kanan, if you used to say he's a ballet dancer, I would believe you.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, that's good to know, Dana. I appreciate that. And by the way, I watched your spoiler-free review. I know you don't like the magical stuff, Dana. I think I know what you're talking about, but it's not so magical. It's not so magical. but I mean, look, that's the central challenge of doing this, right? Which is, how the story ends. So how do you tell it from the beginning? Which again, is the central challenge of any prequel or origin story. In the case of this, we know that Kanan and Jukebox both die. So to that extent, but I think, that's also what makes it fun, is we get to explain how they got to become who they became, as realized by 50 Cent and Anika Noni Rose. And I think, as is the case with most people, it's family. It's family and friends and the environment in which you're raised. That's the stuff that really sort of define us and give us our identity. And so I think, as when I was first presented with this opportunity, I felt really strongly that I wanted Kanan to have I really wanted Kanan to start off in a very, very different place than he ends up emotionally and sort of, and so I think, that gives me a lot of runway in terms of story, and it also allowed me to really flesh out this world with family members. And again, his mother, who, is obviously a central piece of who he is.
I also love is the 90s is captured so beautifully. I'm like grabbing my mother. I'm like, is this true? She's like, yes. And so what I wanted to know is, how do you craft such a beautiful arc in the 90s where it's its own character, and also why the 90s?
Well, I mean, two things. Why the 90s is because we went back to Kanan being a kid, and of course he would have to be a kid. That would be the time frame for him. I think, I was alive in the 90s and pretty conscious, so and I was in New York, so I have a pretty distinct sense of the way things were at that time. I think what's cool and what's fun is that it does, and you were sort of saying this, is like the 90s is sort of a character in the series, and it really gives us this chance to, explore the fashions and styles and music and cars of that period. It really brings you back, especially for your mom and for me. We were both alive then. And that's a really, period is challenging. Doing a period piece is always challenging from a production standpoint and whatnot, but it's also really, really cool. It's like we show up on set one day, I'll show up on set and it's like I'll step onto the block and it's all cars from, 1991 to 1978. And it's just like, all of a sudden you feel like you stepped into a time machine. It's cool.
We talked about the duality of season 2. My question is, looking as a viewer, should we also pay attention to nature versus nurture?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is fundamental to the story and the tension. And I think that's the question that we all sort of ask ourselves, is as human beings, but also as parents, right? Mm-hmm. Which is like, and I think that's really part of Rock's journey, is like, these choices I'm making, not just for myself, but for my son, what are they going to do to him? Now we know the answer to that. We know that at least they're going to contribute in some way to whom he becomes. But, I think, the nature versus nurture thing is really, that's a question that the audience will on a certain level have to decide for themselves. Did Kanan end up that way because of how he was raised, or did Kanan end up that way because that's just who Kanan is? I think I fall into the sort of, if I'm being honest, I probably fall more into the nurture category than the nature category. In fact, I think I lean very heavily in that direction as a parent and as a person. But it's a great sort of tension to have in the series, for sure. Great question.
So much for doing this show and for speaking with me. And thank you for checking out the review.
Absolutely. Well, Dana, thank you for everything you're doing. Really appreciate you.